Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Cheyenne and I'm continuing my series on communication studies theories. So I've previously talked about semiotics, representation theory, communication models, and all of those are like communication studies theories. But now I'm gonna make that jump to cultural studies with this video on encoding and decoding. In my past videos, I talked about basically a single cycle of communication or like a single circuit of understanding. So there's two people talking or there's an image that you're trying to decode. But when we talk about cultural studies, we're talking about realities, like people growing up in societies, cultures being developed by multiple communications, multiple meanings being circulated. So at this meta level, all of these meanings are being organized by codes. And these codes are all related to each other and they come together to create larger meanings. And these larger meanings are what hold societies and cultures together. So in the process of communication, when the meaning is being created on one end and understood or interpreted on the other end, those moments are discursive moments. So discourse is a theory by Michel Foucault, and it's basically how people talk about things, especially when there's like a collective understanding. And this collective understanding is about people decoding a message the same way that it was encoded. The level of understanding between the encoder and the decoder after the communication process has been completed depends on how much the encoder and decoder share the same codes. So sometimes people share the same codes so often and for so long that they become subconscious. Like you no longer even need to interpret it anymore because you just automatically know what happens. The understanding comes so quickly. And that's sort of how you come up with a dominant cultural order. When codes are shared so pervasively throughout a culture, people automatically interpret everything the same way. And so there's a preferred meaning in society. But ultimately, encoding can only force so much meaning into a message. It's really up to the interpreter to decode it the way that the encoder expected to. And when that doesn't happen, you have negotiated or rejected meanings. And that's when you can see fissures in the culture of people not seeing things the same way. Okay, so Stuart Hall in 1980 had a really important work on encoding and decoding. So in this work, Stuart Hall talked about the past way that theorists were looking at communication. So when they were analyzing communication, it was really focused on the message exchange. It was focused on the sender, the receiver, and that circuit that happens between the two when they're exchanging messages. But Stuart Hall thought of it very differently. He thought of the message and communication as a series of moments that were all linked together in a larger process. And that process was production, circulation, distribution, consumption, and reproduction. So there's a really important paragraph in this text that I think sums it all up in a very Stuart Hall way that is convoluted and hard to understand. So I just want to break that down because I think it's very important. So he says in the text, the object of these practices is meanings and messages in the form of sign vehicles of a specific kind organized, like any form of communication or language, through the operations of codes within the syntematic chain of a discourse. There's a lot of big words in there, so I'm gonna break it down for you. So basically what he's trying to say is that you have a sign and it's going through all these motions, the production, the circulation, distribution, consumption, and reproduction. And this sign holds meaning that it intends to communicate at the other end of this process. And this sign operates in the context of a language. And so there's certain codes and conventions in this language that are gonna affect how the message is encoded. So these codes that are part of the language give and shape the meaning of the message. And so the codes are used to create the meaning. So as this message is being transmitted through the communication process, it's in its discursive form. It really is an effect of the discourse around its message. So when the message is in the production side, when it's just in the sender's head, it's not discursive. It doesn't have to relate to what society says you have to say or how you talk about things. It's only when it comes out of the sender's mouth or comes out of the sender through images or through a piece of art, that's when it's discursive because it now has to be interpreted based on codes in society. So if the sender wants to communicate a specific message, it has to use these codes or it's not going to make sense to other people. So the example that Stuart Hall uses in his text is television. So an event can happen in society on its own in reality, but it doesn't become a story until it goes through television. And television has its own codes and conventions that it needs in order to communicate a message. So try to think about it like reality TV. So obviously there's cameras trying to capture people's real lives, but the conventions of television affect the reality of the situation. Two people can be talking and camera can be on them, but there's also things happening around them that might affect the conversation that the cameras aren't picking up. And then you also have editing. So editing can affect, how conversations develop. Things can be taken out to make it shorter. All of this is done to create overarching storylines across the episodes of the season. So although it's reality, we all know that it's not really reality because television is affecting how this message, people's lives, the message, is being communicated. And another place that this happens a lot is advertising. So a lot of times, like in perfume ads that I talked about in my past videos, they spend a lot of money for these 1 minute, 30-second ads to create a whole entire world. And they're bringing in multiple codes to encode the message so that you understand it the way that they want you to understand it. When people are encoding stuff in television, they're doing it so that there's no like discrepancy in how they want their message communicated. So think about like the Keeping Up with the Kardashians or Vanderpump Rules. Kris Jenner and Lisa Vanderpump are executive producers on these reality TV shows about their lives. And that's because they want to make sure that when the show's finally aired, they don't look bad. The people that they care about don't look bad. And so they have a say in how the message is crafted throughout the season. So in my other video, you talked about signs being arbitrary, and that's because the codes that are connecting the signifier and the signified are in flux. Society changes, culture changes, people attach different meanings to different codes, and now those signs sort of break apart. So when people are communicating messages, and in those moments, those specific moments of encoding and decoding, the degree to which the receiver understands the message the way that the sender intended is dependent upon how much of the codes the sender and receiver share. If they don't share the same codes, and the receiver is not going to interpret the message as intended. So when Stuart Hall was writing this piece, the past research about communication was really focused on behaviorism. And behaviorism is really saying like people respond to their external environment based on the interactions that they have with those environments. So if something happens to them repeatedly, then they're always going to respond or learn to respond in a particular way. But what Stuart Hall is really trying to do is like include the inner thoughts of a person in their behavior. In the communication process, or when someone is interacting in a culture or in a society, their upbringing, their thoughts and ideas, how they think about the world have an effect on the way that they communicate in this culture. It's not just about the external environment. So he has another quote that I think is really important. And in the quote, he says, "Reality exists outside language, but it is constantly mediated by and through language. And what we can know and say has to be produced in and through discourse." So I think this kind of like wraps up the topic really well, in that everything happens to us outside of language. Like things can happen to us without us speaking, but when we have to communicate what's happened to us to other people, we have to do it in a way that they're going to understand. And the only way that people understand are through the codes that we share together. And if you don't use those codes, there's going to be a disconnect in the communication. So we talked about codes a lot, but I also want to add to the conversation like the different types of signs you can have based on the strength of the code. Codes gain their strength by the amount of times that they're repeated in a culture. So when a code is widely distributed, everybody agrees that this is how the code works, this is how the signs of that code work, then the code almost becomes naturalized, and the sign that is associated with that code becomes like fixed in society. It's almost as if like the world was created that way and there's nothing you can do to change it. So Stuart Hall calls this a naturalized code. Naturalized in the sense that we no longer have to process its meaning. When we see that sign, we don't have to process it. We know automatically what the intended meaning is. And that kind of hides the language process, the communication process behind it, right? We're no longer thinking about the meaning. We're no longer thinking about the encoding and decoding if there's a disconnect, because we all automatically agree like this is what it is. And this is kind of how ideology works. Like there are so many things that are fixed in society that nobody questions it. It becomes an ideology that's entrenched in our minds. But what makes a sign ideological, what makes a code ideological, is its level of connotation. So signs can be denotative or they can be connotative. And denotative signs are basically descriptive, right? So like if I see a tree, continuing the example from my semiotics video, if I see a tree or a picture of a tree, those are descriptive signs because I can clearly understand that this looks like what it's intended to mean. But connotative signs operate at a higher secondary level. They're no longer like looking at it and just like understanding what it means. You're bringing in other ideas, other mental concepts to associate with this sign and its code to give it a larger meaning. So at one point, a naturalized code, a universal code, was connotative, right? Like people had to think about all these ideas to bring it together to like understand this single code. But once it becomes universal, it almost becomes descriptive. Like it takes a step down where people no longer have to think about those larger ideas. They just like automatically know what it is and it becomes descriptive. And once it's descriptive, once a connotative sign is descriptive, like that's very, very powerful because people are no longer questioning its meaning. They take it for granted. So just to give an example of connotative and denotative signs, like you're watching me make this YouTube video right now. I'm sitting in my room. And I make videos like this all the time. So like you can see my computer, my desk behind me. I'm wearing like, you know, nice tops when I'm talking to you guys. Thanks for watching, by the way. Don't forget to like and subscribe. But I have this whole setup because I talk about my undergraduate degree. If I was talking about like cooking, there would be a different setup. If I was talking about like my general life, I'd have a different setup, right? So like all of these signs behind me, the clothes that I'm wearing, the computer, the desk, my bookshelf, like this is all to like help you understand that what I'm talking about is to be taken seriously. Like for instance, if I was just talking about like nonsense, or I was talking about like my life in general, I wouldn't be sitting in front of my desk. I might be wearing sweats. You know, like there would be different levels of meaning created by the types of signs that you see in my setup. You're watching this video on YouTube, you're not watching it on like a network streaming service. So the level of production is going to be different because, you know, I'm not gonna produce for TV when I'm sitting in my bedroom posting on YouTube. So the denotative signs of my setup would be like my desk, my shirt, my computer, my bookshelf, and the connotative signs would be like academics or going back to school, theories, communication studies, like all those bigger ideas are being like drawn in because of the signs that I have surrounding me. So the point that I'm trying to convey is that codes are interrelated, signs are interrelated, they play off of each other. It's not that you look at an image, get its meaning, and like that's the end of communication. Like communication happens constantly, it happens with everybody constantly, and how people communicate with each other, the meanings that they develop in their minds, the mental concepts they construct of their culture affect how they go and then communicate with other people around them. So connotative codes, connotative signs are very important when we're studying ideology. When we study why a culture acts a certain way, why a culture has a problem with another culture, it's because of the ideology, the fixed naturalized codes that a culture has that determine how it interacts with itself, and that determines how people within the culture interact with each other. So every society and every culture has a certain classification of its social, political, cultural world that it tries to impose on the signifiers in its culture. And that whole process, the production, circulation, distribution, consumption, and reproduction of these connotative signs is how a culture creates a dominant cultural order. So these are patterns of preferred readings, like we develop ways of understanding the images and like messages that are coming towards us in a way that like, you know, higher ups want us to understand. So a lot of these theories about encoding and decoding, maybe not like those exact words, but the theories of communication studies came out of a time in history when there was a lot of propaganda, there was a lot of like political upheaval with Mussolini and Hitler. And what these theorists were trying to understand was, how did these dictators get so many people to believe in their message? What was really going on in the surrounding culture that allowed for like mass amount of people to follow these types of leaders? So these people in countries that were following these leaders at the time, they were interpreting those leaders' messages the way that the leader intended them to interpret. They had a dominant way of thinking and their followers accepted that, right? So the level of likeness between the leader and the people were the same. But that doesn't mean that everybody accepts things the same way. You can have negotiated understandings or rejected understandings. There might be a dominant cultural order at the time, but that doesn't mean that everybody accepts it for what it is. So you can have a negotiated decoding of a dominant cultural order. So a negotiated decoding would basically mean that you accept the larger message for what it is, but there's certain parts of the message that you're not really okay with, certain parts that you disagree with. So at that lower level, you kind of have your own rules that you play by, but like overall, you're like, okay, like I can go with this. And then you can also have an oppositional decoding. That's basically when you get the message of dominant cultural order and you're just like, not feeling it. This is not right. I don't agree with it. Everything you're giving me, I'm not picking up. I'm not decoding it the way you want me to, and I'm not going to try to decode it the way you want me to. And in all of these types of decoding, the emphasis is really on the receiver's internal processes, how they see the world, the maps of the culture that they have in their heads, the reference system. All of these things play a part in the communication process. So basically what Stuart Hall was really trying to highlight with the encoding and decoding process was basically like, these are the moments in the communication process that has to be focused on the most. This is where signs are constructed. This is where they're given their connotative meaning. This is where the connotative meaning is then interpreted by other people that have societal and cultural effects. So when we study cultural theories and we study communication theories, like these two moments at the opposite ends of the communication process is where we need to focus, because this is where power is at play. So all in all, the encoding process is when the sender pulls in signs from the connotative level and descriptive, denotative level to create a message with a particular meaning. The decoding process is when the receiver gets that message and has to use the same codes to interpret it the way that it was intended. But if they don't have those codes in their head or in their mental maps, then the message isn't going to be interpreted the way that the sender expected. So these are obviously Stuart Hall's most important contributions to communication studies. And in my next video, I'm going to talk about the power effect of this model, right? Like, how does this all build up to ideology, to discourse, to power, and what does that mean for culture and society as a whole? So once again, thank you so much for watching. If you like this content, don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Leave a comment for any questions you might have. I always try to answer all my comments, and thank you for watching.